There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another kind of book club discussion of another Edith Wharton novel. I am here to discuss with these lovely people Edith Wharton's 1923 novel, A Sun at the Front. And I am joined by Chris of the fabulous book podcast, The Book Cougars, joining us from Connecticut, and James of the fabulous Twitter / well, no, it's Twitter. It's nothing. There's no other name to call it. The Twitter account, Caustic Cover Critic.
Yeah, that's right. BlueSky now. I abandoned Twitter in the whole.
Oh, you have?
Oh,
Is it
you
the
did?
same,
The whole
Same
same
master
handle?
nonsense.
Okay. I'll redo that. James, formerly
Sorry.
of Twitter, and now under the same handle, Caustic Cover Critic on Blue Skies. And Dorian, who is co-host of another fabulous book podcast, One Bright Book, and also the creator of the book blog. I've been practicing here, and I've written it down phonetically. Ager Munch Jonfrau.
Way to
How
go,
did I
Shawn.
do, Dorian?
Pretty good. Pretty good. You passed. Yeah.
And so we're all here to talk about this novel. And Chris has designated the order of who's going to check in first, and it's me. So let me just say a word about spoilers before we do that. The four of us are going to check in on our general reactions to the novel in a spoiler-free way right now. Then I will give a brief description of the opening premise of the novel after that, and these people will correct me. And then we're just going to put the spoiler wall up, because then we don't have to worry about spoilers from then on. So you can decide at that point whether you care about spoilers or not and keep listening, or go away and read the book. So I'm going to enjoy going first, because last time we did Edith Wharton's novel Summer, and I didn't care for it nearly as much as these guys. So I'm sure they're all quite curious to see how I got along with Sun at the Front. I absolutely loved it. I really deeply loved this novel. I think I connected with it emotionally more than any of her other work, some of which I have really loved. It was the father-son relationship that I got really emotionally invested in once certain things happened, maybe towards the middle of the novel, and then I was just hooked on what was happening between not only the father and the son at the front, but also the stepdad and the father. All of that just mesmerized me, as well as the descriptions of experiencing the First World War through the eyes of an artist and faces. All of that I found absolutely wonderful. So so no more absolutely's for a while. So I utterly love this novel. That's my first general check-in. Who's next? James.
Yes, I enjoyed it hugely. It's not my favorite Wharton. I'd say she's a writer with a number of masterpieces, like, for me, inarguable masterpieces. And this is maybe a rank down from that for me. But I enjoyed it hugely. I thought, yeah, particularly, as I say, the way she writes about art extremely knowledgeably, for someone who, though she wasn't a painter herself, had a huge amount of experience in writing about design and decoration and architecture. She really knows her stuff, but can also put it across really vividly. But yes, the relationship between the father and son and the stepfather and son, and the way she writes about that kind of where you're going from being a parent with a child to being friends as adults, but friends who have these hidden areas of your life from each other because of the parental child thing. I can't think, particularly at the time, I can't think of any other writer who was doing something. It must have been quite a new thing, the way she wrote about it. And also considering her own personal experience as a writer who'd gone to the front and written about it and wrote a book about France at war and had seen the fighting, that it's a World War I book that doesn't ever take you to the front from the viewpoint of the characters. Even when someone visits the front, it doesn't tell you what they saw in terms of battle. It's all behind the lines and mainly back in Paris. And that restraint is quite interesting, I think, as I say, for someone with her personal experience.
Dorian is next, alphabetically.
I think restraint is a good word. I like that, James. Yeah, and the behind the scenes, that's the right word, behind the front anyway, kind of quality of the novel that I found engaging. I don't know that I liked it as much as you two. I was always really interested in it, but Of the Whartons I've read, yeah, I agree, with James, in that sort of like a rank down. I struggled with the main character with Campton, and I find him really difficult, and difficult in an interesting way, but not as interesting as, say, Newland Archer, who I think's, speaking of those masterpieces that you mentioned, James, like Age of Innocence probably is just a great novel of the 20th century, I'd say. So titanic. And there's a similar kind of thing going on. Those books are very proximate to each other in her body of work, in Wharton's body of work, in terms of like reading against the character. But I was struggling a little more in this case than I did with Age of Innocence. And I don't think that its female characters are as compelling as in some of her other works. So I have some reservations about it, but it's a really interesting book, and I'm super glad to have read it and really looking forward to our conversation. What about you, Chris?
I did not like this novel.
Oh.
I admire it greatly. I think it is outstanding and fascinating. I really appreciated the relationships, the way they were. It's all seen through Compton's eyes. Like he's the only point of view character, and he's not exactly reliable. I don't know if that's a spoiler, could be, but I really admired the way Wharton, the restraint that she showed was very obvious, and just the sense of Paris during World War One. I've read a fair amount of World War One novels and histories, and I've never read one like this before. That is completely from the civilians' point of view, and then an artist too. And I kind of feel like he's an artist who doesn't really see. He sees what he wants to see, and that puts another layer on things. But the relationships with the ex-wife and then her second husband, I thought that was really well done. Just the tension, the main character Compton, his back and forth about everything, that felt really real to me. Never having lived through a World War, I can imagine just the back and the forth and the confusion and how rapidly things were changing. And I just thought that was very brilliantly depicted. But overall, I was really happy when I finished because I was not enjoying the experience, but I tried to admire her artistry.
This was so well planned. Maybe Chris orchestrated this. We had a descending order of interest in the novel.
So I hope you're all going to gang up on Chris instead of me this time.
She never said anything bad about Tove Jansson, so she's already ahead.
Yeah, seriously.
The night is young. The night is young.
I don't think we've forgotten that, because we have not.
Yeah.
And
You're on the list.
I hope you saw Ronan Hession weighing in on a comment on that video.
Yeah,
I was very
in support of
disappointed.
me.
Had to burn my copy of Leonard and Hungry Paul.
I am deathly curious to find out exactly what Chris didn't like, but why don't we save that until we're on the other side of the spoiler wall so that you don't have to hold back. Let me just give a quick synopsis of how it opens. This opens on, July 14th, sometime in July 1914. It's the night before World War I breaks out. And Campton is an American artist. He's been an emigre artist in Paris for most of his adult life. And he has a son who, just because of that, was born in France, who would have to go fight if war is declared, and war is declared. He and his son are on the verge of taking some European trip. The next day, war breaks out, and his son George goes to the front. There's a lot of characters in this novel for its size. But I would say the other two main characters, or two of the other main characters, I guess I should say, are Campton's ex-wife, George's mother, Mrs. Brandt, Julia, and her second husband, who is a rich banker, Anderson Brandt. And there is no love lost at the opening of the novel between our point of view character, John Campton, the artist, and his ex-wife and her second husband. And I think that's enough of a premise. Did I miss anything major there? Please.
I guess just the no love being lost is not based on any unpleasantness. It's really no love is lost because his ex-wife's new husband has basically done everything he can to support his stepson, and that's what probably rankles more than anything for.
And has had the means to do so, and he hasn't.
Maybe one other thing I'd add is that George doesn't go to the front immediately. He is sent to a kind of staff position. He's behind the lines, and that is as a result of some kind of machinations that Campton and then Brant have worked to pull some strings, etc., to keep him safe. Then this becomes a kind of, this chafes at George, and so then the front comes his time at the front comes a little bit later than that.
That is an extremely important correction and addition. Thank you. Yes, that is definitely true. All right, so as I said a few minutes ago, we're now going to put up the spoiler wall just because we can't be bothered to keep track of what might be a spoiler or not. So consider yourself warned. And let's dive in. Chris, I'm dying to know, what didn't you like about this novel that you haven't already told us?
I just didn't like Campton. Is that how you pronounce it? Campton? I did not.
He's a pain in the ass. Yeah.
He is another privileged white guy who is whiny and has talent. Painters at this time in Paris are the rock stars, right? So he is a rock star. And as Adele says, one of the other characters, Adele, is a character who was in Paris, I think a generation ahead of Campton. And she was there supporting her brother, who was an artist who didn't make it, but she stayed on in Paris because apparently she loves it. And she's been like a little bit of a mother to George and also takes care of Campton. As she says at one point, when Campton is complaining about Brant and his ex-wife and their money, she says to him, you wouldn't be who you are. You wouldn't have been able to become the John Campton you were meant to be without their support of George and taking that off your shoulders so that he was free to be an artist. And so I feel like he's had a lot of things given to him and he just complains all the time. And he's very judgmental and he flies off the handle. And I just feel like I don't really enjoy reading about men like that because I've been there, done that. So that was interesting to have that reaction, and I was really excited to talk to 3 guys about this because, and I was wondering like how much of my reaction is a gendered response to a character like this.
And I think one of the things that made it perhaps less than her best work for me was the lack of viewpoint female characters. Because we see all the women in the book refracted through Campton's viewpoint, and he just sees his ex-wife as just a silly woman. There's nothing more to his opinion of her than that, really. But yeah, and with Adele, though he keeps turning to her for support and comfort, he does hold her in private contempt a lot of the time. And because we only see the women from his point of view, that does blunt one of Wharton's great strengths, I think. And the other thing that took it down a notch for me, I'd have to say, is most of her great books, for all their seriousness, are actually quite funny in places, particularly the kind of social conversation comedy. And this, except for I've forgotten his name, but the American guy who he spent one night in a prison before being locked up in a hotel for a week.
Mayhew.
And he just spent time going on lectures about how he suffered at the hands of the Germans, which was quite funny. But other than that, it's not a book with a lot of humor in it, really. And I did miss that. So those are the 2 things that took it down, I think, for me, from the stuff of hers that I've liked the best. So I can definitely see what you mean. I guess as a curmudgeonly man, a curmudgeonly man as a viewpoint character definitely bothers me less than it's going to bother Chris. But also, I think perhaps reading it at the time it was written, I think he would have been more of a novel character just because, I don't know, he has the kind of vacillations in his character, I think, was something that was done less at the time. He's much less of a type of books, I think, of earliest 20th century characters. But I'm not explaining myself very clearly. But yeah, certainly reading him now, there's definitely been a lot of people like that in a lot of books. So.
Yeah, he's almost like that hermit, that artistic hermit, who he has no one to really call him out on his behavior or to talk to. Like he is just in his own head all the time. So even when people are doing really nice things and trying to be helpful, he's just so judgmental. Like he's sneering all the time. And he says some really cutting and mean things to people, which I appreciated in a lot of ways, because I feel like that was one of the strengths of Wharton in this novel, is really depicting this human being, like warts and all. So again, I admired the writing and the presentation of this character, but it just dragged for me because of who he was.
It's such a solitary kind of a book there, and there's that moment early on when Campton is thinking about he's walking through Paris and there's no one around, and it's emptied out at the beginning of the war, and he says something about, and this is again the cutting and sneering and the sort of this misanthropic thing where he's like, too bad war kills people because it sure makes things quiet or something to that effect.
Improves the view and
yeah.
Hotels are not as crowded.
But there is a book about people drawn into themselves because of fear, I think, so much. Like a lot of people just we're waiting for letters, right? Or telegrams or like the bad news from the front and the way that can draw people into themselves. So I think there is something about Campton like that's unique to him, is peculiar to him, but is also a little bit more generalized. I wanted to say something quick about the point you were making, James, about the point of view and stuff. And it's the contrast to Age of Innocence is so striking to me because that's a book where we're in Newland's head, we're in a male character's head, but we have this really rich and incredible sense of female characters there. And as I was reading this book, and here's where I'm a bit like Chris, I think, like I kept thinking of all the people that I would rather have at the center of the book. I was like making a little list. So Brant is number one for me because I'm like, I think he's incredibly fascinating. I'd love to talk more with you all about. He seems so brave to me, that guy. I'm thinking about Adele Anthony, who I think is a really fascinating character. And I think it's so interesting the way the novel kind of puts her as both a weird mother and sexual figure to both the father and the son, but never really develops either of those things. Like that was interesting to me. And even Madame Lebel, the concierge at where the building where he has the studio, I think is a really fascinating figure. So I was like, I want to know more about these people. But then,
also the fortune teller.
I will shut up after this. But one more thing I want to say about that is that. But then I did have to realize that I think it's the indirectness of the presentation of those characters that is in part what makes them fascinating. So I don't know if putting them at the center would have given me what I think I wanted, if that makes sense. But anyway, I think there are some pretty fascinating minor characters in this book. Maybe we can talk more about that. So are you going to convince us, Shawn, here why it's?
I've been thinking about my reaction as I've been listening to yours, and I'm thinking, I don't know if it was unconscious, that this was written by a woman and she has created a really believable, cranky, grouchy, talented man with all kinds of nuances and putting him through all kinds of paces. And I didn't get invested in the book until George was wounded the first time. And then I got so emotionally pulled into that extended hospital scene and all of that, and was in tears for a lot of it and reinterpreted a lot of things that I had read up until then. And from then on, it was a page turner just for the character of John Campton and his son. And it's not that I wasn't interested in the other stuff, but I didn't really care about it viscerally. But that just carried me through. I think I approached it as this is an incredible portrait of a man written by a woman. And if it had been written by Henry James, I'm not going to go off on a rant about Henry James, I don't think I would have enjoyed it nearly as much. So I'm flipping what Chris said. I think it was a remarkable literary achievement because Wharton really captured the narrowness of that kind of a man's view on life.
Yeah, he's a paint in the hole, but he's a completely vividly, believably drawn paint in the hole.
Yeah.
You don't doubt him as a real person at any stage.
For sure.
Yeah, no, and that's why I totally admire the novel in Wharton's craft, artistry, with how she created him. And to Dorian's point about wanting, I had at one point thought what I would like to read is a novel with everyone, these peripheral characters take on Campton. What do they think of him? What would the novel be like if it was through somebody else's eyes and how they saw him? Yeah, because the whole thing with the father, like I did feel for him with his desire to want his son to himself for a while, to have that time together, because he's 26 at the beginning and he still refers to him as a boy. He's always a boy, I think, until he's in uniform, maybe.
Yeah,
he's referred to as a boy. And so I really felt for that as a divorced dad who he only saw his son on holidays, basically, because he did his service in the French army and then he went to Harvard. So he's been in the States. And so he hasn't seen him for a long time. And I really felt that desire to have him to himself. That was really
war
touching.
Aside, he's going to go back to the States to work as well.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I didn't really care too much about, I wasn't invested at that point, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't until the son was wounded where it's, just really grabbed me.
Yeah. I do have to say, it was a bit of a page turner for me for a while because it has different books in it.
Yeah.
And I do have a little note card where I jot down some notes. And I had book 2, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh, it's book 4. So I was just cruising through it for quite a
Yeah.
long time. So I do admire the writing,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I
Leave it
would
at
be
that.
so curious to hear it because we're all, I think, of basically similar ages, I think. And I'm curious. I was thinking as I was reading the book a lot about my childhood in Western Canada. So maybe, Shawn, you can resonate with you. And the way that World War One resonated so strongly in my upbringing and education. And like when Remembrance Day, which is what Canadians call, what Americans call Veterans Day, or Armistice Day, is I guess is maybe called in other places in the world, in November, came around, there was this sort of, I mean, what I now look back on as like this kind of almost cringingly patriotic self-sacrifice model. In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow and stuff like this. It was still a period where there were still, I think, some veterans alive from World War One. And I think it's just really different now, right? Because so much time has passed. And it's interesting, I think, for us to have this geographic variety here. James, I'm curious for your take on what it was like, what that has resonated for you in terms of Australia's role, and Chris especially, because a lot of this book has to do with, come on, Americans, get in the fucking war. And I feel like that World War One is not really a huge thing in American life because it came in at the end. It seems to me, but again, I didn't grow up here. I live here now, but I didn't grow up here. But it seems to me that it doesn't have the kind of hold that, like, I think in the Commonwealth, and maybe it's just Canada. I don't know. That's kind of one thing curious to hear from James about.
But
About the role of this particular war. And is it making any sense? I'm just curious to hear.
yeah, it's definitely not just Canada. I mean, in Australia now, and it's become more so really since all the veterans have died, to a ludicrous and over mythologized state. The founding myth now of Australia in popular culture, if you're inside Australia, is Gallipoli, where for the first time Australia was fighting a war as Australia, because it was lots of separate colonies until start of 1901, and then it became a nation. And, what all these people just got to fight for king and country and went off and were just used by the English as absolute cannon fodder. Australians and New Zealanders and Indians just by the thousand, just chewed up on the beach. And now it's this kind of central thing in Australian culture where if you don't have deep but deeply uninformed feelings of patriotism because of Gallipoli, then you're not a real Australian. And yeah. It's quite peculiar the way that's only intensified, really. So yeah, it is this deep part of the culture. It doesn't tend to go along with knowing much else about the war or anything else, but that one campaign, that one event does, yeah.
And I had to look this up just to make sure I'm remembering correctly. But yeah, World War One was Canada's last colonial war, so we automatically entered the war because we were part of the British Commonwealth, and that changed by the time World War Two came along. So yeah.
Interesting.
My grandfather fought in the First World War, and we have his letters back to his parents. I still have them in my possession, and I have a photograph of his whole, what do you call it, battalion or whatever. There's about 200 men, and the picture is so crystal clear that with a magnifying glass, you can see the faces of these soldiers as if they're standing in front of you. It's just a chilling photo, chilling in a good way. It's just a beautiful keepsake. So yeah, World War One is certainly loomed large in our family history.
Yeah, same for me, although maybe for different reasons. My grandfather also fought in World War One, but for the Germans, and he was wounded in the First War, and so that was a bit different. When I was growing up, we used to go every Easter to a place called Cantigny. It's in the suburbs of Chicago. It's Cantigny Park now is what it's called, and it's a museum to the 1st Division that one of the newspapermen in Chicago had served in. And so it was a memorial to his division. And they had a trench there that you could walk through the trench and hear bombs, and they had tanks that the kids could crawl on. And it has really grown over the decades. I went just before we moved to Connecticut. Again, that's the suburbs of Chicago. I went one last time because it's grown into such a spectacular museum about World War One. So that was a big part of my childhood. And then I served in the Marine Corps, and we were really inundated with a lot of history. History was something we studied every day in boot camp. And I don't know how much you guys know about the Marines, but like devil dogs is one of their nicknames, Teufelhunden, which is a nickname that the German soldiers gave the Marines in World War One. So I feel like my background's a little skewed with World War One, but I've always been fascinated with it because of my grandfather fighting for what is
Yeah.
now the wrong side. But yeah.
That's so interesting. And the reason I asked this question is because as I was reading the book, I was like, wow, this view of World War One, it just feels so obviously of its moment. But I mean, like that sense of the Germans are clearly the aggressors and the barbarians, and like they are totally in the wrong and they are uncivilized and the destroyers of civilization. I think now the research on World War One is it's a lot more complicated than that, right? The kind of I was interested in the kind of nationalism, I suppose, of the book. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, it was taking me back to my childhood when thinking about the way in which World War One was celebrated. And it was a little bit by that point in the 70s of what war is a terrible folly, it's horrible, but still amazing and awesome. And we should be very, like, proud. And to go to your point, Shawn, like, it's a colonial war for Canada, but it's also often thought of as the war where the Canadians really became the Canadians, like taking Vimy Ridge, or half the male population of Newfoundland dies on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and like these kinds of stories that like stitch together the nation in a certain way, at least the English-speaking nation of Canada. So it was really interesting to me to read this novel that is, I don't know, pointed in its take on the events in a way that seems now feels really dated to me. Anyway, yeah.
Yes,
I'd
absolutely.
have to say that
I totally agree with that. And I love how complicated, how complex her exploration is of all that nationalism stuff through the eyes of an American expatriate whose son is just accidentally having to fight this war and all of that stuff. It could have been a much more straightforwardly patriotic tale that she was telling, but she
also
did
because
introduce
it's despite being an anti-isolationist book very strongly, it doesn't shy away from the fact that almost everyone who holds that point of view and says we must go out and fight the Germans is dead at the end of it. You know, they all go into the meat grinder and they all die. She doesn't.
Good point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no one of them. So
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think her portrayal of the like those behind in Paris, a certain kind of like artistic world, but also a sort of moneyed world that fancies themselves being very brave for continuing on everyday life in the face of this terrible tragedy, but is really like self-aggrandizing, and there's a lot of graft and stuff going on. I think she's very pointed in that regard. There's a lot of criticism there that I found that quite interesting too.
Yeah, that was really fascinating too, how that shifted. So, with the goodwill initially of starting these organizations to help refugees or wounded soldiers, and how it eventually becomes an opportunity for people to make money. And then, even it made me think about what's been going on in the United States a bit, how
we go.
like you think about like the World War II and the Nazis have always been the bad guys. And now we've had a president who has said there are two sides. There are good people on both sides. And so some of that made me think about current events to make it a little bit more timely, but also how you have the stories from World War One about soldiers on the battlefield having truces and hanging out and talking, and English soldiers talking with German soldiers about how they studied at Heidelberg and, oh, I studied at Oxford. And so the combatants had more in common quite often than they did with their people back at home. And as Campton says, he'll never understand really what his son has gone through. I'm not sure what exactly my point was, other than I felt like there was some resonance to today, even
Absolutely.
though
I think, yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely, especially that sense of the initial moment of crisis and rallying together, and then the fatigue that comes from that, and then how that can turn into cynicism and like making money off it, as you said. We could think about whether in the Canadian sense of accepting Syrian refugees, or in Europe and Germany, for example, taking Syrian refugees, and we can do this, and we're going to make a big effort, or you at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine or something like that. And then eventually the kind of fatigue with that, and now turning against refugees, like reaction against it. I do think she is showing us some sophisticated kind of like politics in the novel in a way that you don't really often see in these kinds of books, because the politics is either the battle politics, strategies type stuff, or it's politicians kind of politics. This is like a different sphere. This is like people setting up organizations, to charity organizations, or helping refugees, or distributing donated clothing and stuff like that. I found that those parts of the book really pretty
Yeah.
compelling.
The fact that it was written by someone who was there and lived in this society at that
Yeah.
time, just the texture of day-to-day life that it captures, and that I suspect no amount of historical research for a historical novel maybe would have been able to capture. The vividness of it really is quite fascinating. And also just the way that it captures, this is what you were talking about, the way people are really hyped up at the start and then they get tired of it. The way it captures the mindset, particularly in Campden, but of people in general saying, oh, it can't be a war, it's impossible, can't even think of that. And then when it finally starts saying, oh, this is actually really quite exciting. And then as it goes on, I'm over this now, and it's just, I'm bored, I want to go back. This is the most overwhelming feeling I have, is the tedium of the way this is affecting me personally, rather than the kind of human carnage going off somewhere else.
Just too, like, what do you do when this war has been going on for years, and the people who want to live their life and get back to the things, like George is telling his mom to go back to her bridge games and stuff like that, because what are they fighting for? Are they fighting for, it's total war, right? It was the first war that was total, meaning civilians were involved in ways they had never been before. But just as somebody who has served in the military, granted it was a million years ago, the attitude was like, you're serving so that Americans can continue to be Americans and can continue to have diverse opinions and opinions you don't agree with, because you're serving this idea. And that kind of comes in a little bit. I don't know if it's who says that, which character says it, but it's just like, we're fighting for people to be able to live their lives, to live French lives, and to carry on. And so I know there's some of that, the wealthy people are being frivolous about it, and maybe they don't care about what's going on with the war at all. So I think there's just those different levels that she shows, which is so fascinating to see this picture of Paris during World War I. The only other books I've seen Paris represented about, it's troops marching through or somebody just home on leave, and never this extended look into it.
I'm noticing we haven't really talked very much about George. Is that because he wasn't really...
Great observation.
What did you think of the characterization of George? I don't mean to say something so simplistic as that I liked him, but I thought his characterization was quite nuanced, but I'm not thinking of anything to contribute to the conversation about George. What did you think about George?
He's very convincingly shown as this kind of charismatic and very lively character. He's the whole point of the book, but he spends almost all of it off stage, and his communications with his father are often strategically leaving out huge bits of information. So though he's the linchpin of the book, he's not a major character. So I've got a dog. So I think that's
dog interruptions are always welcome.
Nice. Do any of you know Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room?
Yes.
Published 1922, so the year before this, and it's a great war novel in a way, but also like at the end of the book, Jacob too you would think is at the center of the book, and is actually not really. He's always known through his absence or whatever, and so there's something of that in this book. Shawn, I'm really glad you brought this up. It's because I think he's a strange character, and I think a lot of it has to do with the title of the book, which I was thinking a lot about, which is it can refer to both subject and object, right? Like a son at the front can be like the person who is the son who is at the front, so that's George, or all these other people other men who are sent there. But it also refers to them as a kind of object, like, in other words, the references to people who have a son at the front, and to having a son at the front. That seems to be the thing that is more interested in almost. And so in that sense, George, he matters, but he doesn't matter as much as he might in a different kind of book. And so I find that I have a lot less to say about him because it's the other. I did think, by the way, that like it was pretty obvious early on that he's like lying about where he is. But I think he doesn't seem as important to me.
Camden even seems to sort of suspect that, but not let himself fully say it out loud.
He didn't want to know.
Yeah. And there's the intro to this version mentions that Wharton, the first publisher, didn't want to publish it because it's a war novel. She suggested changing the title to Paris or Their Son. And I thought like Their Son is really telling, because it's not about George at all. It's about Campden, but also the other two adults. Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting. And another thing is, tying this back to Summer, the book we last discussed, Wharton wrote Summer during World War One, and she talks about Lawyer Royal, the father in Summer. Remember him, the stepdad, another
Yep. Yeah.
stepdad, right?
Yep.
Wow, just
Yep.
made that
Yep.
connection. That he was the shadowy father figure in her novel Summer. And this is a quote from Wharton saying he's the book. And I think like we talk so much about Charity, and the father came in a lot, or the stepdad came in a lot. So it just made me think about those two men, Campton and Royal, and what Wharton was trying to depict.
My absolute favorite moments in this novel were when Campton and Brant are together. So to pick up on your point, Chris, about like fathers and stepfathers, and it seems like Brant is the kind of like total flip side of someone like Royal. It's so dark, problematic, whereas Brant is not saintly, but he is George's father too. There's that great line about like how not only Campton had to admit what that Brant didn't just pay the dentist bills, but he was also there helping the kid to blow his nose when he was sick. Like he was
Right.
doing it all. And like the delicacy that Brant has, that's where my heart was breaking. You were talking about your heart breaking earlier, Shawn, like in terms of every time Brant has to step back and play second fiddle because he's not the real father. But the very ginger account, like relationship between Campton and Brant, I thought that stuff was really great.
Oh,
And also the fact
Yeah.
that both Brant and Campton, they both fulfill a father role, even that's more unusual at the time. Like the fact that it's a father even contemplating blowing the children's nose rather than it just being left to the mother is quite unusual for the time, whether it's the biological father or the stepfather.
Yep.
Yeah. And we're not talking about George again.
That's true.
But
yeah.
it's so easy not
I
to
feel
talk
like there's
about
not.
him.
I feel like there's not a lot to say about George, and I
Well,
think
like the
really
part
kind
of him that I
telling.
found intriguing is that we really obviously we experience him through his father's eyes, and his father is really struggling to know him, and all of that I found fascinating. But he is driven to return to the front, and what do we make of that? Is that noble?
I think it's typical of the time period.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Is it
I mean,
relatable in the year 2025?
yes, I just read The Militia House. I'm sorry, I don't remember the author.
Oh, it's
And it
okay. We
was
can look it up.
written by a veteran who served in Afghanistan. And it's a horror novel.
Oh,
and that's
yeah.
really,
I have read that. Yeah.
yeah. And the main character has that drive too to return to his men and to be there and not feel like he's abandoning them, which is really fascinating because Campton totally abandoned his wife
Yep.
and his son.
Yep.
And
Totally.
now he wants to have it all. He's that kind of guy. And he projects so much. Like I was really pissed off at him towards the end when he was totally dismissing Julia at the end as not really loving George, that Campton loves George so much more, and even Brant loves George so much, but the ex-wife is incapable of loving him. And I thought, where is this coming from? He's just, I think, projecting.
Yeah, it's because his feelings are complex. They make them more real. Whereas you can be a straightforward person without complex feelings, but your love is still as strong and as painful just because it's not multi-layered with all sorts of other competing problems that you, in some cases, invented for yourself, the way Campton has.
Right. And he even looks at their relationship, his ex-wife and with her second husband, as if the only glue they have holding them together is George.
Right.
So like he sees everything in life is through George for him, to the point where now that they don't have George, they're not going to have anything in common. When I think all throughout the book, you see these two, they're a couple that's really simpatico. Like they're really
I agree
together.
with that. Yeah, I agree with that. And he wants George to become a version of himself, like to not go into the bank, to strike out on his own in some way, to be artistic, whether that's actually to be an artist, but to be spiritually artistic, if I could put it that way, free-spirited. And it's totally unclear to me that George has any inclinations that way. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem, oh no, my life's gonna be over because I gotta have to go into the bank. Obviously, that never gets developed because that events take a different course or whatever. But yeah, I agree. This is all to agree, Chris, what you're saying about that kind of projection in a way. Can we talk super briefly about the Spanish woman?
The fortune teller and
the fortune teller. Who, this is a woman who appears initially in the novel as a girl and is apparently totally non-entity, but she is the reason why when Campton and his wife, when they're still married, they're on this long tour of Spain, he basically leaves her because he sees this girl from the window of a train as she is the true Spain. I must paint her. And he spends a month like painting her or whatever. And Julia's like, fuck this shit. And goes back and like divorces him and stuff like that. I was quite sympathetic to her in that moment. And anyway, and so it feels like this person is just there as this is just part of this anecdote of like how that marriage fell apart. And it tells us something about Campton, blah, blah, blah. But then there is later in the novel, there is a woman who is a fortune teller who has caught the attention of many sort of wealthy women who have sons who are fighting in the war, and they go to her regularly to try to get news of what's happening to them, what will happen, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that this is the same person. And so there's a whole potential kind of melodramatic story that could happen there that doesn't really. And so I'm wondering what that stuff is doing in the book.
I did like the lack of melodrama though, and that she secretly has a son at the front too that she knows nothing about, and she's trying to get information on from him. I thought
and she's making up all this clairvoyant bullshit in order to keep her living.
So is the idea that like everyone will do anything for their sons? Is that the idea? Or is the idea that is there supposed to be a critique of this idea that anyone could know anything about war? Like you can't really know anything about war. Anything we would say about it is bullshit unless you're actually in it. Is that one of the things that this character is like doing here? I was a little puzzled by this.
I had forgotten. I knew that he had crossed paths with her, but I'd forgotten that she was that woman from the very beginning. That's fascinating.
Like in terms of, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about like he's an artist who's supposed to be able to see things, but he's also so blind, and that's sort of the central irony of the book. And like this woman is one of the first instances in the novel of like when he really sees. Apparently initially his paintings were not that well received or weren't even that good maybe, but he had this kind of breakthrough. And I feel like in my memory of the book anyways, like that encounter with this girl like was what sort of launches that. So he is there as like the thing that he can see so clearly. And so there's a lot of stuff going on with true seeing, not seeing, false seeing, something like that.
Yeah. She sees what people needs, I think, is obviously the big message
which
of her.
He
like
totally does not, Chris. That's the thing that he can never do. Yeah.
And when she does, she won't take money under certain circumstances either. So I think like she's trying to make a living and have money for her son, but I don't think is just
she's not
taking
a grifter,
people's money.
Right? Not the way some of the other characters
like
are,
a professional
right?
reassurer rather than a full-on con artist.
Yeah.
We should probably think about wrapping up fairly soon, and I'm going to pose my last question. And if none of you like this question, I'll just cut it out. Is this an American novel?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I think it is. I think it fairly centrally is.
There's very few characters in it who aren't Americans, even though it entirely takes place in France. Everyone in it pretty much is an expatriate, either permanently or temporarily. You don't see very much at all of what actually French people are doing, except the family, I've forgotten their name, but who have gone through hell and he's trying to help through the charity that then later gets hijacked. So it's almost entirely Americans' point of view. There are a lot of, I think you'd say, there's a lot of great American novels that are all about Americans fucking about somewhere else, and I think this falls into that category definitely.
Yeah, because there is a sort of Jamesian thing at the beginning, like this American wealth that then needs to go to Europe to become sophisticated and stuff to really see properly. Like that's Campton's story, right? You think you talked about how this novel's not that funny, James, and I agree. But one thing I think that is funny is that Campton's family's money, in as much as he has, and he comes from this thing called the mangle.
Yeah.
That is some ancestor had invented this. It's like it's like a mop or something like this, but it's like the mangle, and that seems like such a good description of the front too, right?
Yes.
Because that's what happens. That you talked about the meat grinder before, James, right? And that's what happens to these guys. So it starts off with that kind of the sort of Americans, they're not good for anything but money kind of thing, and the Europeans have all the taste and the art and sophistication, and there is that background, and then it goes in a bit of a different direction. The little I know of Wharton, like she loved France. And that meant a lot to her, and being there meant a lot to her. And that experience of the war in France was tremendously significant for her. And so it really feels like such a Wharton book. Yes, American for sure, but also so invested in like America's need to ally itself to France or something like that. I really like that.
That's it, because she lived in France, she died in France, she's buried at Versailles. She saw herself, she never saw herself as a French woman, but France was such a core part of her identity, I think.
Yeah, like she left America after she was divorced, or to get the divorce there, because the attitudes about divorce weren't as
Mm.
hypocritical as here in the States. And then I'm not sure, from World War One, the only time after World War One she went back to the States was like in 1923 to get her honorary degree. Was it the honorary
Interesting.
degree from Yale or for the Pulitzer? It might have been for the Pulitzer, but
I
and
don't
then she
know.
never went back. Yeah.
I think the
Yeah.
Pulitzer she won in 1920 though.
Was it
So
20?
I
Okay.
think so. Maybe it was the honorary degree. I don't know. You obviously
It
know
was,
more
Okay.
about her biography than I
but
do.
she was
So
also
yeah.
decorated by the French, I think, for her war work as well. I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yes. Yeah.
you could totally see why.
Yeah. Talking about Americans, money, and just how young a country America still was at that time, there's then the whole issue of an entire generation being wiped out in World War One. And there's one point where I
Mm.
believe it was Campton talking about turning somebody into an artist, or but wishing he could go back 2 or 3 generations to make that current person an
Oh, I
artist.
remember what you're talking about. That's actually
Right.
That's Adele who
Oh,
says
there was
that,
it
and she's
Adele?
talking about
Okay.
when her brother flamed out as an artist, like he didn't make it, and she was says something
Okay.
about, yeah, if I was going to do that, I would have need to go back 2 generations.
So just having that continuity and that culture born into people, and then just what a break World War One is, that it does destroy an entire generation. And somebody even says at one point, it's not just the generation, but it's the generation that would have produced the next generation is also in part wiped out. So that was really one of those moments that really made me think about the entire world and like the 20th century as a whole, and what we've done to generations and culture.
Has anybody shifted their opinion from this stimulating discussion? I still love it as much as I did going in, but I think I understand it a whole lot better. Chris, have we
You know
moved?
what? I really admire it, and I
Yeah.
think it's a great book. I like Others have said I don't think it's like up there with The Age of Innocence or even The House of Mirth necessarily, but I really admire the novel tremendously, but I did not enjoy it. I don't think it's one I'd ever reread, but who knows? Never say.
Never say
And I
never.
don't know that I would recommend this one to very many people. I think it would have to be a particular need that somebody has, like wanting to know what World War One was like for civilians in Paris, or a writer who wants to create a character, a point of view character who's
Mm.
unreliable and not very likable, but you do have moments of intense feeling for this person and what he's going through.
I
Mhm.
think admiring a
I
book is a really good thing. Do you know what I mean? I think again, maybe I like it a little more than you, Chris, but I'm feeling similarly in the sense that I think I do admire it more than I like it or love it, but that's
Mhm.
okay. And I think this conversation, as I anticipated, is really did help me think further through it, which is like fantastic. I think I'm glad it's back in print in this Oxford edition, and I think I hope it does get a few more readers. But I wouldn't recommend it to someone as, oh, you've never read Edith Wharton? You should start
Right.
front. I wouldn't do that, but yeah, I think admiring something can be. I feel this is an undervalued critical position, I guess is what I'll say.
Yeah.
Like we're often really
Hmm.
fixated on did you love it or not, but
Yeah.
maybe we don't. Maybe that's not what we need to think about.
I'm still wearing my heart on my sleeve. I loved it. I love the portrayal of the father-son relationship. We didn't talk much about art, and that's okay. We've talked about a lot of important things. I would recommend it to somebody interested in the novel of an artist. I think that was
Mm-hmm.
really quite subtle and nuanced. And
Mm-hmm.
father, son, and First World War, all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
James, any last thoughts?
I mean, yeah, again, I liked it as much as I did before, but I do feel that I do understand it more too from having had this discussion.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. But yeah, again, I wouldn't say if you haven't read Wharton, read this one to start with. But having read a lot of Wharton, I mean, it's odd, in fact, in some ways that this has fallen through the cracks as much as it
Mm-hmm.
has, because it's not one of the big ones that's been published by everybody, and it's not one of the odder ones that Virago republished for a long time. I think, but I actually had a copy before this, which I was proud to get rid of so I could get this one because it was this really horrible old university press one with tiny type. And it's odd that
Mhm.
that was the only way you could get this until recently. So I'm surprised this has been as neglected as it has been.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
It was a very stimulating discussion as usual. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
we
you.
do.
This was
Thank
super
you, Shawn.
interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, really
James, Dorian. Always
grateful.
great talking with you guys.